Lutheran kind of denomination.
Okay. Is it progressive at all? Do you know?
Well, what isn't?
That's the problem. I know.
Yeah, I don't.
It was
I
hard
don't,
to.
The last time I took communion with the Covenant Church was in. Well, no, I guess yeah. It was before. It was like the '90s, so it was before wokeness really caught on. It was still PC was still kind of not. It was something looked down on in the conservative Christian communities.
Not so much anymore, unfortunately. Okay, cool. We're going to unpack that for sure.
Okay.
We can start recording anytime, or if you're ready to go.
I'm always recording. So
I know you're a busy guy.
Yeah, no.
We're
Thanks
going
for the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to have you since you were one of the first people that gave me an opportunity. It might be really fun, and you typically aren't the one being interviewed. So I thought this might be really neat to kind of pick your brain about your background, because I realized when I was talking with you that first time, I was like, I don't know anything about him. He's always the one asking questions, which is certainly a role for that, but we would like to know a little bit about you. So let's solve all the world's problems here. That's what we try to do over here.
Over
Benjamin, where? Over here on my little podcast called Trad Queen Story Hour.
Oh, Trad Queen.
My husband named, yes. So
where is the plaid?
Where's the what?
Trad plaid? Don't they have some sort of plaid things?
I don't know.
Trad girls? Don't they wear the plaid dresses? Yeah.
No, they're just traditional, like housewives, which is basically what I am now, aside from my little YouTube hobby, where I talk to people about ideas, which is basically my favorite thing on earth. So we're technically recording, but we can clip whatever you want or don't want. We don't say any bad or mean words. We don't say the T word. We don't call people any kinds of slurs. Obviously, you know the rules of YouTube. You seem super successful.
Like testosterone?
Tranny. Yeah.
Oh,
the T people. Yeah.
Because turf is also a T word.
Technically correct. Yes. Yeah. So is like tortoise. So we don't say any T words at all on this podcast. I'm just kidding. Okay. Quite the challenge.
Watch
that would be fun. We're going to be really thoughtful about our words for sure. So my husband is technically my producer. He'll be listening in. He may be chatting at us over the course of the
If I flirt, it's just my style of conversation. It's nothing offensive intended.
All good. You talk to so many different people. You have to find ways to coax things out of them. I'm sorry to hear that about Polly. I hope she's okay. She's been going through some exciting times.
Oh, yeah. She's a lightning rod. Yeah. So she'll
is.
recover. It was just somebody broke into her car and took all her stuff. So
was she in London or where?
I don't know. She's in one of those British communities out there on that British Isle of Britannia.
Yeah,
maybe.
I know.
I don't know if it's
last
London
thing I saw her, she was getting the Andy No treatment with, I think, ketchup or something.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't think those people realize how much of a martyr and how much of a hero that makes her look like.
Yeah.
They don't seem to understand marketing at all, right?
Well, see, that's the thing. If you look at what's happening over and over and over, and you've been studying the media cycle much more thoroughly and deeply than I, with all of your work that you've done in the media sphere, but you see that the narrative is always controlled. That they'll prop up, they'll forget about, they'll memory hole a martyr, and then they'll, like what happened in. What was it? Tennessee?
Nashville.
Nashville. As soon as that happened, everything, the whole narrative apparatus, and everybody got on board with covering that up. So
spraying into motion. Yes. That was interesting to watch, and I hope that a lot of people were red-pilled off that, but who knows? I know that some people are really deeply entrenched and there's just no hope for them, but to anybody who was even slightly paying attention, they were probably like, oh, that was weird. Why aren't they paying attention to the people who were actually, murdered? Who knows? It's probably just a quirk. I don't know if you follow David Marcus, but he recently said no one in the mainstream media is lying to you. And I was like,
What?
You're gonna run that by me again?
Wait, who is this guy?
Crazy.
Is he in the mainstream media?
He's a commentator. Well, no, not really. He goes on Fox sometimes. He's technically a conservative. I was just like, what? How could you? You're just saying that for engagement. Are you engagement farming? Because that's kind of what that feels like.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I was like, wow, okay, maybe not. All right, let us get into it. We'll be a little bit more structured, but we're just going to meander. There are no rules, except we don't say mean things, and we try to be nice, and I try to ask reasonable questions. No mean things.
Okay.
We don't say like the N-word or anything, so we'll keep
Okay,
it
yeah,
kinda
yeah.
nice.
The language
that
I
kind
know,
of thing.
but sometimes I get snarky. Is snarky?
No, you can be snarky. Yeah,
Okay, because
no,
that's kind
take
of
it
mean,
away.
technically speaking.
It's all good. You can take it away.
I'll try
All
to
right.
be chill then.
No worries. Good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to join you once again with a calm voice of reason, Benjamin Boyce. You've probably seen some of his interviews during your journeys across YouTube. It seems like he's interviewed pretty much everyone under the sun, including me early on, which was a great chat. I believe he titled that conversation Lifting the Lid because he's very talented with these names. He also has a podcast called Conversations because he has quite the gift of naming. So go over and check out his interviews and his podcasts. Benjamin, how are you doing and what have you been up to?
I'm great, Lit. How are you doing?
I am
just
doing well.
doing the content creation thing, which is what we're doing now. So
That's awesome.
this is
Yeah, I reached out to Benjamin and I was like, hey, would you like to join me one of these days? And he's like, well, I just had a spot open up this afternoon. And I was like, great, let's do it today. We'll do 2 today. It'll be awesome. So, Benjamin, you are in your very secluded looking area. From my understanding, you are in the western part of the United States. Is that correct?
the Pacific Northwest, actually. I'm outside of Olympia, Washington, in the great rainforest of Thurston County. I think it's one of the wettest places in America, the continental U.S., other than like some county in Mississippi, because they have hurricanes there. So it's just always, always wet and rainy here.
So, how is the weather treating you over there?
It's okay. I mean, it's just,
Damply.
keep on going. Yeah. I get mossy and then I just have to
Yeah.
scrub myself a little extra. I finally got one of those back scratchers that's ergonomic so I can reach all of the little like fungus and
Nooks
whatever.
and
it's growing
crannies.
on.
Yep. That doesn't surprise me at all coming from someone who lives over in that part of the country. How are the politics over there right now?
Washington State politics is pretty darn left, and I haven't really been keeping up with it because it's just so far woke that there's really it's one-sided, especially because it's controlled. It's basically controlled by Seattle and the Puget Sound, which is very left. And then there's, a great swath of red country on the eastern side of the Cascades, but they don't have the balance of powers, not at all commiserate to any sort of like competitive co-processing. The Democrats do control everything and they do get whatever they want. And it's just the same thing. They a couple years ago, they started up an office of equity. And I went through and I watched the formation of that office of equity. It was just insane stuff. These people in this interminable meeting coming up with all these reasons why they need to control every single aspect of the government and make sure that they have the purse strings at their command. And they were saying things about how Washington needs to become more like South Africa, because then people can just walk into a meeting and we don't have like a white Western way of like being on time and being agenda driven. We need to let go of these different things. It was just off the wall, kind of like complete flouting of any sort of responsibility for public funds,
South Africa is an interesting role model to take.
It's actually, I see that a lot. A lot of people praise South Africa in the equity business. It's kind of like,
Really?
okay, is this where we want to go? Because,
Let's unpack that.
apartheid,
There's a lot there. Yeah.
truth and reconciliation, brownouts
Farmers.
constantly, little secluded areas where I think the biggest, like and this is just off the top of my head, but one of the biggest growing industries in South Africa is private security. Because
that doesn't surprise me at all.
It's South Africa.
Because reasons, yeah. Well, as I recall, there is a little town in South Africa that I think is probably one of the last places in the world that is whites only, and it's called Oriana. So I'm curious now if their goal is to divide people along those lines so much that they actually get what I suspect is their end goal, which is actually fully segregated society away from people of other races. Am I crazy? Do I have that backwards?
I don't know. I mean, apartheid, it went. There's no reason for it not to come back. I mean, it's really interesting thinking of the race issue, and that's where I started with the race issue. I've moved on to the gender issue because the race issue is it just feels so dead-ended to me. It's like there's so many people with so much invested in keeping that aggression going, and so much so that it just constantly evokes itself. It constantly recreates the racist discourse. Constantly recreates itself. The thing about gender is that it constantly recreates itself by creating more human beings. So it feels a little bit more generative than race war kind of stuff. Even though the gender issue right now is pretty fraught.
Yeah, it is fraught, but it also is on a very basic level much more interesting than the race thing. I feel like we've had the race conversation a lot of times in the past. You got your start on the Evergreen beat, right?
Yeah.
With all the chaos there at the school. Do you want to remind everybody what happened there? I think everybody's forgotten. I have not forgotten.
Oh, you have not forgotten? Well, I do have a very, very thorough documentary on my YouTube channel called The Complete Evergreen Story. But in very brief, what happened was that Evergreen State College is a hyper-progressive college. It was started as a very experimental college, had a lot of promise, a lot of really good things going for it, but kind of got stuck in a perpetual cycle of hiring more and more leftist professors. And because it was kind of secluded and because it started out kind of experimental, it was ahead of the curve of most of academia. And academia now we can see throughout America for the last 5, 6, 7, probably even 10 years. I guess the first breakout was in 2015 with Nicholas Christakis in Yale with the whole, this is not an intellectual space, we're creating a home here. But at Evergreen, it was like this pressure cooker for what would be called wokeness. At that time in 2017, it was called SJWs, and YouTube was filled with these SJW compilations, and Milo Yiannopoulos and Ben Shapiro would be getting canceled and stuff. So we saw that in utero. But now it's just a standard thing. I think kids go to college now expressly to get their protest points in. And the administration's cow to the protesters because it's just a rite of passage now. It's just something you have to go through. But at that time in 2017, there was some false allegations of racism that spiraled out of control due to social media mismanagement of the administration of the issue, and then a bunch of just cooped up students that were kind of failing and needed to express a bunch of energy and express a lot of frustration, and then demand a bunch of grades by basically taking over the campus, taking people hostage, stopping cars, facilitating who can come and who can go, and they live streamed it all on the internet, and probably 20, 40 hours of footage of them just acting like complete asshats, wandering the campus with baseball bats, beating up people who were writing in chalk on the sidewalks, "We want class, let's talk to each other," and they're like, "Freaking fascists," and they beat people up.
Yeah.
So that happened. Brett Weinstein was embroiled in that. Brett Weinstein had connections through his brother Eric to Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin. So the publicity it ramped up right away. Twitter, YouTube, it flooded with reactions to all this footage, which is just total crazy footage. And nobody had actually seen the whole story because the footage was completely from the phones of the students. But I had been working in the media department, and I had seen all these workshops and lectures and seminars that were teaching the students to do exactly what they did. And so what I ended up doing was going through and getting all of those videos and all of the internal documents, and then uploading as much as I could online to show that it wasn't just the students acting crazy. It was the entire academic infrastructure, the faculty and the administration that was wanting and cooking this revolution and not really understanding what they were dealing with.
That is such an interesting revelation. So you were just the man in the right place at the right time to really expose this full story.
Yeah.
And I think that is fantastic. I'm very glad that you were there. Do you think that this has been so we're kind of jumping into this a little bit quickly because usually I wait a little longer to ask people about their conspiratorial ideas, but do you think this was a conspiracy? Do you think this has been in the works from some kind of overarching bad person, or just a natural outcome of liberalizing education, higher education?
Yeah. Well, okay. So once you start asking those questions, there's places to go down. So is there a centralized plan, or is this kind of an emergent property of some sort of elite theory or of decay of these institutions, or is it something inherent in what we call liberalism that leads to progressivism that then leads to hyper-progressivism or progressivism, whose sole focus is on total emancipation and then total forced equalization of everyone, a total forced process. And as I have gone on my journey over the last, I guess we're coming on the 6th-year anniversary here in May of that, and kind of my political awakening, which was a dark awakening. And I'm really, personally, I at this point in time, I very favor the elite theory. You just talked to Aaron McIntyre, which would be kind of a Machiavellian theory of power and how power always conserves itself and absolute power always conserves itself. And that's the one theory that makes sense of how Nancy Pelosi acts and how George Bridges acts, how the protesters act across the nation whenever certain events happen, and how the entire media apparatus reacts consistently to favor one side, which is always what we call left. And left means total, utter emancipation of the will of the human being, and then total equal, which is, it just doesn't make sense because you can't be completely emancipated and completely equal at the same time. So what happens is the power of the state comes in and gives you all of this pseudo freedom, libertinism, and then suppresses all of your aspirant desires, your competence, by submitting it all to libidinal urges. And that's why you consistently see sexuality centered on this, and degenerate sexuality, because that's the way to short circuit people's ambition so that they get immediate pleasure. Anything that leads to immediate pleasure disconnects their their long-term goals, their self-reliance, and then their ability to stand up against the state in unison and create a state that's more in cohesion with the goodness that the people want, or is what good for the people.
That's fascinating, because I had somebody say to me the other day, because I was engaged in that discourse about Budweiser being so, ridiculously off the wall with their most recent ad campaign. And somebody said alcohol really is like an opiate of the masses. If we could get people to stop drinking, it would make people less malleable to this authoritarian government idea. And I was like, that's interesting. Now, we know that the history of alcohol is such that the working class has always used it to kind of make life a little bit easier. And for that reason alone, I think that you probably shouldn't try to take it away from everybody. And we know that they tried to do that during Prohibition, and that did not end well. So that was just an interesting kind of tie in there that I'm seeing. I think that you're correct about using immediate gratification and this hedonism to distract people from possibly seeing serious problems in the way the state is run. Now, you mentioned your political backstory, so I wanted to ask, you're from a progressive part of the country. Is that where you're from originally? And what else transpired to turn you into kind of the thinker that you are today?
What transpired? Well, I was walking along the road on my donkey. My road to Red Pill Damascus. So I guess it's interesting because, I grew up in California, but Northern California outside of Sacramento, which in the 90s, I was born in 76, so 80s and 90s. And that was still pretty conservative. It was outside of San Francisco, LA, and California is still pretty blue outside of very powerful centers. Just like in America, like you have this blue, red.
Red. Yeah. I know what you mean.
It's even still, like, I should know that, but red Democrat, but then red not Democrat. Okay, whatever.
Yeah.
And then lightsabers, like, which one is the red?
Who
and the
knows?
blue one? Who knows?
I don't know. Red's not good, but
But I started. This is probably part of my awakening. I started, my first job was a paper route when I was 11. So, I learned, money management, getting up at the crack of dawn, like delivering papers and stuff like that. And then I did that throughout my formative years into my teens. And at some point, I think in my freshman year of high school, I stumbled upon this this radio guy who had a radio show in Sacramento and one other place, and his name was Rush Limbaugh, and he had these 3-hour spiels that he'd go, and he'd do all these different segments. He'd talk about feminazis, he'd talk about like animal rights lovers, and he would just rail against all these people, and it was really fun and engaging, and I would just like listen to it, and that was kind of, there was something about the guy's charisma and humor that I really liked, and then I kind of stopped listening to him, and I went away to Bible college, and I came back, and he was a big deal now. He got syndicated, and he had a brief TV show and stuff, and then he became the icon that we knew later on as Rush Limbaugh, and kind of led that kind of neocon conservative push against the liberal media, the mainstream media, and stuff like that. So that was kind of like I've sided with him, and then I'm also a Christian, or I was a Christian. I grew up Christian, so a lot of the core ideas and ideals of Christianity still stick with me. Like, I try not to talk about abortion, but like I just have I cannot stray away from, this is a life and death issue, and this is something we really need to take seriously, because if we start to play around with the language of what a child is, what a fetus is, what's to stop us from playing around with the meaning of what a woman is and what a man is? Like, once we start to destabilize ourselves from reality and from some idea of the sacred, then the whole structure of language falls apart. So I am very, I don't even know if I want to say conservative now, because I'm still trying to figure out the proper words for that, but I do want to conserve, or at least adulate, the transcendent and the sacred and stuff like that. So while I really disliked George W. Bush and his response to 9/11 and rushing into the Iraq War, just totally ticked me off. I thought that was a terrible, terrible idea, and I protested against that. And then I was totally trying to get George Bush out of office, vote for Kerry, back in that time. Ooh. And when Kerry just kind of threw the election, I'm like, it's all bullcrap.
Fake. Yeah.
This is all fake. Yeah. So I had so much of my heart wrapped up into it that I'm not going to invest my heart into this stuff anymore. This is just just a show. But I was in Portland, Oregon for my 20s and in my 30s, and being surrounded by a lot of progressives, and kind of Obama. There was just this. I would see them. I would see progressives and liberals in Portland and then in Washington just assume things about the world that they weren't aware of their own superiority over everybody else. And that always just kind of ticked me off, because they didn't kind of understand how privileged they were, ironically enough, and how universalist their ideas were, how they thought that their way of life could just be projected onto the rest of the world, and that they're at the end of history, ergo they're on the right side of history, ergo they get to judge what's right and wrong, and just kind of amalgamate and homogenize cultures and submit them to this progressive idea. And I always kind of resisted that, just aesthetically, because I could see where it was headed. And then at Evergreen, when I got on campus at Evergreen, and you see this unfettered progressivism, and you see I worked a lot in preschool while I was writing novels in my 20s and working in preschool. And what I saw with this progressive Kool-Aid given to the students at Evergreen was that these were, I had spent, 10, 15 years trying to turn kids into adults. And then I watched this progressive stuff turn adults into kids. They would go right immediately into tantrum mode, immediately into just very short-sighted thinking, very big emotions, it's very urgent, and the entire world's on fire if they don't get their little sippy cup right now of justice, right? And I'm like, what is going on here? This is so immature. And then the way that the adults were unable to respond to it as anything other than devouring mothers, as anything other than coddling mothers. There was a lot, just a feminization of the academic institution, and that turned everybody into children. So you had this Robin DiAngelo suckling this Negro baby, right? There's just this perverse kind of childization, infantilization of the black folk. And I could show you the footage of that. I don't mean to be offensive at all. This is the way that they would talk and the attitude that they would have.
Right.
So I was always kind of subtly reactive, but then my reaction got stronger and stronger and stronger as I saw them violating the principles of maturity and integrity and creating value other than demanding and leeching value out of everything.
It's so interesting that you made the connection to the feminine so early on, because this is something that I now see everywhere. I've been against the 19th Amendment for quite a while now, and it's not necessarily because this gives women the right to vote. The problem that I see is that it gives people who have no investment in the future of the country, not just a right, but like a responsibility and a moral push to vote for things that they do not understand and with no eye to the future at all. So there's kind of been this interest of mine to see like how the country would have voted if only women had voted, maybe in 2016, 2018, and if only men had voted. And the difference is stark. Like the fact that we have two political parties in this country, and there are, in fact, two genders, I'm going to say it, is really fascinating to me, because I don't know if you're familiar with Verdant Labs. They did a study of different professions and they broke them down along the lines of political party. And if you go to, for example, surgeons, you can see that a vast majority of surgeons are not only Republicans, but also males. And it's so interesting because to me, it's clear to see how conservatism and the necessarily theoretically the party of the GOP would be more aligned with masculine principles. And it's very, very clear that we need both sides. Like we need both wings. This is something that my old boss Tim used to talk about a lot. He's like, you need two strong wings to fly appropriately. And I think that's entirely correct. It's kind of similar to how you have the male and female in a marriage, and you have both, a female to come along and support the shortcomings of the male, and the same vice versa for a male to come in and say, we're going to use more logic, whereas the female is more compassionate and more relationship oriented. When you get any one situation where you only have one voice of one gender, for lack of a better descriptor, kind of driving the conversation, you run into problems. And it feels like this feminization is growing and expanding. Why do you think that is at this point in history in our culture?
That is a huge question. Off the top of my head, I would say luxury. Luxury, there's that meme of soft men, hard times, soft men create bad times create hard men create good times create soft men. And so softness would be kind of, metaphorically or symbolically related to more effeminateness. But also, I do see... in the gender debate is really fascinating. The gender stuff is just endlessly fascinating to me because you have, for instance, you have a lot of like rad femmes or like really staunch second 2.5 wave feminists who are they were totally for sex is a social gender is a social construct. We're going to deconstruct all of the stereotypes so that anybody can be anything and nobody has to be anything. And, we're going to liberate people from the expectations of the roles of what a man is and what a woman is, because a man and a woman are just, these constructs, these sex archetypes. And if you look at their thought, they kind of tend to think that gender stops at the neck, like there's no difference between the values that men and women have. Like it's the very big blank slatist type of ideology that's embedded in that. And I understand why, which would go back to liberalism and the origins of feminism. And I have to recommend Erica Bakuloki's book on the rights of women. She did a really big book about Mary Wollstonecraft and the origins of feminism, and she walks through the historical mutations and permutations of feminism based as a rights-based or liberal project. But you just reduce the woman into this agent, this economic agent, this rational agent that has no particular needs that she wants. And any sort of difference, and you see this in the race discussion, any difference is because of sexism. Any disparity is because of oppression. Because if everybody's equal, then there should be equal outcomes. And if there's not equal outcomes, we need to engineer that because something's wrong with society. I'm getting off point, but okay. So you have in the gender debate with the trans and the TERF wars, you have these radical feminists coming up to they're just bumping heads against the fact that man is physically superior to women, so we're not equal. Men have different values; they compete differently.
They think very differently.
And they think differently. And then even they want to cling to, the Red Femmes want to cling to this idea that men and women are just the same except for the social constructs. But when they get together and act together, they're very feminine in their behavior. There's a lot of female typical aggression, like reputation destruction, gossip, very verbal. Yeah. And so you see that, and then you see this inability of that ideology to recognize that this is how women behave. And then if they can't recognize it, they can't regulate it. And so it kind of goes off the rails over and over and over again. And they do a lot of infighting, and they do a lot of purity checking and purity spiraling, which is very leftist in their behavior. So leftism is not just the seeking of equal. I guess it's fairness, care and fairness, right? Women value fairness and they value care. And putting that in contention with some sort of male virtue, I think that's why I call myself gender positive. I'm not gender critical. I think that if we can lay out male typical and female typical values and virtues, we can orchestrate them more consciously to harmoniously participate in the building and sustaining of culture and civilization. And so we really need more than just a small gamete, big gamete understanding of the sexes.
Yeah, I think you're entirely correct. My argument has always been that there is no war between the sexes. There categorically is not. We desperately need one another. We are not independently complete human beings. We are what we are in assignment with our gender/sex, I think from a very female position, completely independent of the world around me. And that means that I lack the male side of things. This is why marriage is such a powerful tool. And it makes perfect sense to me why the left and why these malign forces are seeking to undermine institutions like marriage and like the nuclear family, because in the nuclear family, you have such positive views of masculinity and femininity modeled right in front of the newer generation. And it becomes very, very difficult then to say masculinity is toxic. No, it's not. I saw my own father behave in wonderful ways toward my mother. I saw him do everything necessary to keep, in my instance, a family of 6 children afloat on a single income, as my mother fulfilled her side of the bargain by shopping extremely frugally and making sure that we bought only exactly what we needed to, and we reused things and made sure that we bought old clothing. But these were both perfectly in balance in my understanding of the world growing up. And that's why when I look at the world and when I look at higher education trying to tell people that you don't need men or that men don't need women, I'm like, that's a lie. I know it's a lie. I've seen it firsthand. Like anecdotally is incredibly significant when it comes to deciding what the truth is, at least in this regard. So all that ridiculous tangent on my part to say I think you're entirely correct. I am arguing that there is no battle between the sexes because we so deeply need one another, in contrary to what the leftists say.
Yeah. Well, and there's a speculative reason why the left would want to attack the nuclear family, because if you can attack the nuclear family, you basically are attacking again individual sovereignty. If you can insert yourself into the family, if the state can insert itself into the family, then it can control the family through bureaucratic means. It can regulate, it can tax the man and then give it to the woman by kickbacks. And there was this tweet that Biden put out, I think it was in November or December of 2021, where he was talking about how unfortunate it was that there were so many women who were taking care of the vulnerable family members. And we need to get them back into the workforce because their true value as human beings as liberal agents as economic units. And so what we're going to do is subsidize a bunch of these, probably we'll import a bunch of immigrants and we'll pay them minimum wage to take care of your family. And then you go out and you work and you love the state. You completely dissolve the bonds of care between the mother and the child and the father and the mother by inserting the state into it. But also, I think in the DNA of the left, is a either deep distrust or open hatred of hierarchy and authority and monarchy. And this is where the left comes from. It comes from a rebellion against monarchy, which also comes from a rebellion against the Catholic Church. If you trace this all the way back to Reformation, and the way that a family operates is through a monarchy. There's a father who's the head, and the mother who kind of they orchestrate an authority together. They have a pair authority that it's sovereign. It's sovereign. Mm-hmm. Why do I have to do this? Because I said. Period. That's purely
at the end of the day,
authoritative. Yes. So the left, of course, is inherently allergic to that authority, to that form of authority. And so it makes sense that those two things would dovetail, inserting the state, the bureaucratic state, and then dissolving those familial bonds, dissolving the divine bonds of mother, child, and father, mother, and child.
That is a very interesting take, and I really like that. So you meant okay. So I want to go back a little bit because you mentioned the Reformation, and I want to make sure I have the connection correct. So you're saying that leftism tends to be in favor of the Reformation because it went counter to the Catholic Church, or like the kind of idea behind the Reformation.
Well, do I
have that right?
This idea is heavily influenced by Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug, who in his open letter to open-minded progressives, which is a tongue-in-cheek title if ever I heard one. I'm kidding, progressives. I know you're tuning in. I'm kidding. I love you guys. You're great.
So great.
He lays out that, and then how Dawkins got pwned. He lays out how progressivism, aka wokeness, he does this brilliant lineage. He traces the lineage of wokeness and progressivism to Christianity, to Unitarian Universalism and Calvinism. And then you can really do see that the destabilization of authority in the West, and then the releasing of the tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous amount of labor force and a tremendous amount of technological progress, it kind of goes back to the Reformation. It kind of goes back to the printing press. It kind of goes back from wresting the divine, taking the authority away from the Pope and away from the priests and giving it to the individual. And you have a puritanical works save us, not faith, or I get mixed up with that. But you get this Calvinist kind of insistence on hard work, on destroying any type of idol, on being very pious. And that strain it's the foundation of America for sure. It's in our veins. We are Protestant to our core, and we're always wrestling with this. So we are leftists. We are actually, even if we're conservative, I think conservatives are always justifying ourselves in relationship to the left. The left, the myth of progress, the myth of utopia, the myth of even transhumanism, that a man's will is central to everything else. Everything radiates from consent, from choice. That all goes back to the Reformation. That all goes back to the other event that happened after the Reformation that's slipping my mind, that we usually stop. The Enlightenment, right?
Oh, yeah.
we people usually peg it on the Enlightenment when we try to talk about liberalism, but I think it goes back to the Reformation. And I think it goes back all the way to the splitting off of the East and the Western Church. I think we are just riding a wave of continual dialogue of resistance against authority in the West.
So if you had to pin it to that one idea, it would be the concept of resisting some kind of higher human power. Do you think that's a good analysis of that?
Disobedience, rebellion, yeah.
Right,
which is my dad speaking. He's really against rebellion, but it's true.
Sure.
We're rebellious.
Yeah, it's true. And that really, I think you're probably onto something with that. Or I should say, perhaps Yarvin is onto something with that. And I need to look more into him because I keep hearing about him. So his ideas are clearly very prevalent, but I'm not familiar with him.
I can give you a
Such.
couple links.
Sure,
if you
yeah,
like
that'd be great,
audiobooks, this guy, Skeptical Waves on YouTube, just processed all of unqualified reservations through Amazon voice technology, so you can get
cool.
you can just listen to the open-minded letter and how Dawkins got pwned. He's such an entertaining writer too. He's just so funny that I don't know if his ideas are correct or not. They're very infectious though. He's very virulent. He knows how to put things together in a way that just kind of wiggle into your brain.
That's great. So he has a grasp of the meme, really, for better or for worse, even without images. And that's kind of tapping into that cultural awareness. So that's awesome. I'll definitely be checking him out for sure. It sounds like he's onto something there because everything you mentioned, I think, is entirely in line with our understanding of human nature. Well, when you mention us being entirely Protestant, this is part of the reason that the Irish were initially persecuted, not prosecuted.
Well,
in the
some
United
of them were
States.
prosecuted.
Yeah, well, some of them, well, for reasons. I mean, there are actually reasons to prosecute Irish people at some points, but yeah. But they didn't want the Americans who had settled here in the U.S. did not want to be outbred by the wild and crazy Catholics who had these huge families. So they made it hard for them to find jobs, which meant a lot of them turned to alcoholism and all this other stuff. So yeah, totally. Definitely. I think something there entirely. So really can recommend everybody check out Curtis Yarvin as we go forward for sure. I love these overarching ideas. Now you mentioned that your family is deeply religious. Do you think that an actual revival of true religion would help some of our problems we see today?
That's a really, really, really good question. And I do not think that a turn to religion is if it comes from the inside out, that's one thing. But if it comes from the outside in, if it comes from top down, it's not going to work. It's got to come from a deep thirst on behalf of the individual, so on behalf of the citizenry, to find the fount, to find the ground of being, to find the pure water of meaning of life, and how we orchestrate that in a post-Christian era, in a post-religious era, in a post-Protestant era, it's just an open question. So I am a liberal in how I behave online. I am open-minded. When I interact with people, I try to attenuate my language to their language. I try to be open to their ideas. So I can't be really fundamentalist. Now, underneath that, once you scratch beneath me being very polite and very, I wouldn't say wishy-washy, but maybe people could say I'm a little wishy-washy or a little
accommodating.
PPC, accommodating, open-minded. I do have values underneath, but they need to, my own religiousness, my own spirituality, if it's real, it will have to be communicated through other means than my belief, other means than my following John Vervaeke, my propositional knowledge. I'm not going to tell you what I believe and demand that you believe what I believe, but I can show you through my actions, through my tone of voice, through my behavior, that I am oriented towards something. Hopefully you see that I'm oriented towards something. If my belief is true, then that orientation will leak through all my actions. Now, at some point people do need to believe things. At some point mythology does need to take place and memes need to propagate. And I spent a lot of years and a lot of ink wrestling with mythology in a creative manner and creating stories. But those stories, those memes, they have to speak to the truth within people and awaken people from within. Now, Christianity, I think one way for Christianity to be returned to is to show people or to make a very clear argument that we are always already Christian. Even atheists, and this is following Curtis Yarvin, even atheists, their entire moral framework is a Christian moral framework. We're always already Christian. Now, to what degree do we need to worship? To what degree do we need communion or community? And to what degree can we rely on a church institution to be any less, or theocracy to be any less corrupt than what we have now, which is basically we are living in a theocracy. That progress flag, the pride flag with the chevron, with the trans, and then the skin color in it. They every year in June, last year at least, the State Department took down the American flag and put up the progress flag. That is the state religion. It is a state religion. Yeah, so 100%. If we can understand that is actually a perversion of Christianity, that if we orient it, reorient it away from what it is now, this progress pride flag, which is just horrific on an aesthetic level. It's just a horrific thing. When I saw it, I thought it was a 4chan meme, and then it became adopted. It became absolutely adopted. It reminds me, do you remember, did you ever read Lord of the Rings or listen to the actual audio?
Yeah.
So there's a scene between Sauron and Gandalf. Gandalf's the Grey Wizard, and Sauron's the Saruman. Saruman's the White Wizard. And Saruman invites Gandalf up to his castle, and Saruman's turned to the dark side. And Saruman shows Gandalf his new robe. He says, "I'm no longer the White Wizard. I'm the Wizard of Color. I've taken the white and I've stripped it apart." And he's wearing this rainbow robe. And Gandalf says, "You've actually destroyed what you are. You've atomized, or you've destroyed the unity and the purity, and you don't have this. It's not anywhere near what you think it is. You broke everything. You can't get to purity through breaking things apart." And that progress pride flag is a representation of unity going into diversity, into diversity in the wrong, improper, inharmonious way. So if you can try to convince people who are already religious, already woke, or even atheist, but still have the same values, don't need to use belief to interact with morality with each other in the world, but see that we are already living in a Christian soup. And if we, through that way, there might be some sort of orientation that doesn't turn fundamentalist in a very specific way, where people are pure, demanding you state certain words, Jesus is king, or reducing spirituality back to that propositional statement and purity checks. I don't know how we avoid that, because certain people are just dumb, and they will do that no matter what. You're going to have that on the right and the left. You're always going to have that. So that elite class needs to reorient itself. And then us dissident elites, which I think is what we are, I think that the path forward is a religious future. It's a mythological future. It's a future filled with enchantment. I don't see how we get there, but I think that it's possible with what we have now.
That is a great breakdown of that, and I really appreciate that reference to the Lord of the Rings, because I'd forgotten about that scene, and now that's something that I kind of want to look up as well. Excuse me, I feel like I'm going to sneeze. Hope I don't. I think that hopefully, I hope that what we get out of, I want to preface this by saying I completely agree with you that any change has to come from the bottom up. And I believe this about pretty much everything. As I said, I'm super, super pro-life, but I am fully ready to admit that has to come from a cultural change, which means that we need to change how we think about things like sex and parenthood and raising our own kids and explaining to them what they need to do and not do, and explaining to them further the value of building a family and being a parent themselves. It's going to take a long time, to be fair. And I think that people really want a silver bullet, and they really want to say, okay, well, how are we going to tackle this right here, right now? I understand. I would love to give everybody this kind of quick solution, but there is no good quick solution to anything of this magnitude. I think that one of the things that separates actual Christianity, actual faith, from this crazy, twisted, subjective reality we're being tossed around in right now that you can feel if you ever go into an actual church. Because when you go into an actual church, what you'll find is objective truths that are thousands of years old, that people of good faith have used to orient themselves, and that have gone out of their way to live and to ultimately die for in many cases. And I think that that's really where this change is going to come from, because when people start to notice that the subjective lies we're being told by the new state religion that you're correct in calling such, what we're going to start to notice is that when we get into the presence of actual objective truth, there's such a great sense of relief that I don't have to be kind of making this up as I go along. There is an overarching truth that I can see and hear, and there is this weight of antiquity or of, pre forefathers, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
People who came before us who were willing to sacrifice their lives for it. That tells me there's something to it. Whether or not I ultimately discover that truth for myself or not, I know that there are millions, billions of people who believe this and believed it enough to die for it. And that alone should, I think, persuade people. And this won't persuade people because, like you were saying, there are some people out there who are they're tribal, for lack of a better word. And if you give them platitudes to say, they will do nothing but say those words, and it will never sink in. It will make no difference to them. And they'll just be kind of doing a version of the left, but from the right. And that's not really what we want either. What we want, and something that we can't achieve for other people, that has to be achieved from the ground up, like you were saying, is for people to recognize we're seeking objective truth. We don't have to agree with or fully understand all of it. And this is something my husband and I were discussing the other day, because he doesn't consider himself religious, but he understands the importance of the Judeo-Christian principles that lead us to have the fantastic civilization that we have today. And he says, it's okay to not know everything about how this all works. This is, in fact, the definition of faith, right? And I was like, you are correct. I think you're coming at this from a totally different angle than I was, because I was raised with all of this as a given, as I think you probably were to a similar degree. But we can't assume that other people are going to know that as a given. People have to reach this on their own terms. And I think that the objective truth is really going to be what shows people the difference between true faith and the faith that's being both foisted down upon us by the left, and that was foisted down upon us by fundamentalists in the past. I hope that the objective truth is what kind of enlightens people to that.
What do you mean by objective truth?
So I think that with the shifting sands that we see, the concepts that you can be whatever you want to be, that nature is as you wish it to be, the whole trans men are women thing, or whatever. I don't even remember. I get it backwards so easily because to me, it's so contrary to what I can objectively observe, things that I've learned when I took anatomy and physiology, stuff like that. When I look at stuff like, the different the sex chromosomes, I'm just like, I don't really see any way out of this. When I was in anatomy and physiology, my teacher, who never told us one way or another if he was a Christian or not, this was in Colorado Springs, which is a super conservative city, but he was very professional. He just basically said, when you want to kickstart a human life, what you have to do is unite a sperm and an egg, and that's when it happens. And I was like, okay, that makes sense to me, because it doesn't really, I don't really know of a different place where it could start. So when I look at truths like that, I'm like, that is such a reprieve from this shifting sand of I can be whatever I want to be, and I can say whatever I want to say, and my feelings are the only thing that matters, and my identity, I could be a falcon, I could be a bird, I could be a unicorn. That stuff is, it's abundantly, actually, factually untrue, as far as I personally am concerned.
Well, yeah, but in the context of church, though,
yeah.
I mean, how does church, which is a symbolic order, orient you toward objective truth?
I think that if you give people the solid ground of saying, God says this, okay? God says that this is true. God says you should do this. God says you shouldn't do this. And then you can listen to what the Bible has to say about human nature versus like hope deferred makes the heart sick. You can say, I've seen that in my own life. You can look at the way that the Israelites were constantly demanding a king from God and wanting, all these visible signs and wonders. You can look at the way the Pharisees treated Jesus, and you're like, the things that the Bible has to say about the way humans work is abundantly, apparently, obviously true. Like you can see it today. You can see people still, being romantic in the way that Song of Solomon encourages people to be, albeit imperfectly. And you can see people despairing like King Solomon did in Ecclesiastes. And it's just, pretty clear that the Bible has a pretty good read on the actual fundamentals of human nature in a way that people who will tell you that you can be a male and a female, or neither, or both at the same time, and you can switch back and forth between all these different identities, they don't seem to have a grasp of human nature. People don't thrive in that kind of subjectivism, in my opinion.
Well,
So
no,
you're welcome to disagree.
I think I see what you're saying, because it's not just about changing sex or changing your gender. It's about the primacy of the human will over nature. It's that will to power, and that is what one could argue quite extensively the Bible is warning or teaching about, or saying that this is a human constant. This is a human constant, and it's death. What does it mean that this is death? What does transhuman mean? What is the will? What is adulating and putting your will above all else? What does that mean? That would be death. I mean, other than the abortion statistics,
right?
Then all the consequences of let's just say child transition. This is all deconstructive. Yeah. It's all deconstructive. The will can only deconstruct. What is the creative will? What is we see? We can probably see that which causes us to flourish is probably more in line with life than that which just expends what we gathered by flourishing, or just expends our energy. And I think that the Bible religious traditions are probably pointing towards that truth. So because I just hear people say, I'm going to go into church and God's going to forgive me for this thing called sin that's has no relationship to objective truth. And the way that you're countering that is saying that the truth of human nature is such that this is what the Bible is talking about. It's not talking about objective reality as in atoms and material reality. It's talking about
that's true. Yeah.
Human reality, which is kind of an amalgamation of, it is very subjective, but it's cyclical and it happens over and over again. So I think that it would be safe to say that this is an objective truth of what it is to be human.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair distinction to make, because as I said when I was talking earlier with Oren, the science and religion are not attempting to explain the same things at all, pretty much, except for, the idea of when life might have begun or who might have kickstarted that. Science and religion are attempting to explain completely different planes of human experience. So yes, the Bible is not attempting to objectively explain, light or matter and stuff like that. But from my exposure to it and from my understanding of human nature through my own somewhat cynical observation of human beings as a whole, I can say that there is a great deal of wisdom in there that people are too quick to discard. Now, as I was saying earlier, when you come in out of the subjectivism of you can do whatever you want to do, there are no limits. And as Oren was saying earlier today, you put these limits around yourself and you are asked to make sacrifices of yourself. That's completely different and even more subjective. But when you put these limits on yourself, you are freed to be like, okay, I am no longer in control of everything in my world. Everything is not putty in my hands, and that's a good thing. It's okay. It's better for it to be that way. It's better to surrender some of this will to power to an actual higher power, to someone who, for all intents and purposes, we can kind of assume has our best interests in heart, because if we believe that God created the world, he's given us this amazing and beautiful place where we can survive and thrive. He's created, he's not destroying like the subjectivism that we see in the world around us. Yeah, so my whole point is that there's too much subjectivity out in the regular world, and then the church kind of gives people this foundation upon which to actually try to build instead of destroying.
Well, and there's more room inside of religion than one would give it credit for. If somebody's been abused by religion or seen religion as a stifling place or some sort of controlling environment, and that is not without precedent or empirical evidence to support such a supposition.
Right.
There still is. So I was reading this Substack about Jacques Ellul, who's a French thinker who has some pretty deep critiques of Western civilization post-Christianity. And he has this theory that technology has kind of taken over everything, and that we can never really reform the systems that we're dealing with, because the technology was preceded by a mentality of technology, or what can be translated to technique, where everything can be solved to be more efficient, where the process can work through all of our problems. And so we have all these institutions that are run on these assumptions that intentional, rational action, policy can solve everything. And the only way that we can solve the problems that all this policy created is more policy, which creates even more problems. And it's a pretty steep critique. I'm still wrestling with it, but I was just thinking about, we can reduce all of our problems to any given dimension. We can say, well, liberalism has these problems with Reformation, or Protestantism, or technology, or materialism, or science, or even religion. You could reduce it to all these different critiques and see different problems with it. But ultimately, I think that the ability to be greater than... Ultimately, what we're looking for is something that can include all these different systems that are problematic, all these different ideologies that are problematic, that can include them in such a way that they become harmonized and oriented towards some sort of higher goal. And a religious framework, if interpreted correctly, and this is the problem with the gender argument, people misinterpret these words that we're using. They misinterpret what a stereotype is. They think of a stereotype just in the gender, for example, in the gender debate or problem. Like, stereotype is essentially bad. It's not essentially bad. It's a pattern recognition software that we run. And it if you teach, and yes, it can be controlling and it can be limiting, but at the same time, we do need to know our limits. We do need to know our natures. And so stereotypes kind of lay out generally the direction that men and women go. And you could probably go along, like, different ethnicities kind of have different kind of stereotypical behaviors that are funny, but they're not exact. They fall away after looking at it. And so with regard to a religious framework, what needs to precede the religious framework is an understanding of what that religious framework is doing. What is it talking about? How is it talking about life? And I think Jordan Peterson has done a very, very good job, a very necessary job of kind of cracking that open and making it a little bit more popular. There's these things called symbolic truths. We can be in dialogue with these ancient stories. The truth that is inherent in them is a very valid, necessary truth that is of a different kind and qualia than scientific truth, than factual truth, than bureaucratic truth, right? But so understand, when entering into a religious framework, it's really important to be on any sort of similar page, to understand what we're doing when we're talking about that framework. But I do think that a religious framework, properly construed and constructed and promulgated or shared, has the capacity to organize all of the different systems. It can actually organize communism and capitalism. Properly construed, we are communal beings. Properly construed, capitalism is very good to engage our desire to work, our ingenuity, and to trade, and to do market signals, to create information and distribute information. And you find in the Bible, and this is the interesting thing that the left says all the time, is that Jesus was a communist. Now, he's not a Maoist, he's not a Stalinist, but there is this sense of brotherhood, the sense of communal, familial ties that bind us. If that kind of communism, it does operate within the family. Capitalism does operate in the family, where you give the kid incentive, you give the kid earning potential, and show that if the kid has value in the system, then he gets rewarded by the system. And then there is a communal, this is ours, right? Now, how that scales up to a society is impossible without some sort of similar orientation to a father God, and to some sort of, I don't know how to place, because I am a monotheist and I am a patriarchal guy. There is a divine feminine, but I don't know how to articulate that at this point. But there is some sort of unifying, horizontal feminine that can embrace the world, and some sort of transcendent masculine that can tie all the worlds together. And I don't think you get communism on a massive scale without a very, very powerful, divine, virtuous populace, right? That does care about each other.
Right.
Right. And so you do need a religious framework. And you see it in communism just assumes this religious framework absent God. And then what ends up in the place of God is human will and bureaucracy, which then becomes pure death.
Right. Well, it because it lacks kind of this understanding of human actuality, like the truth of human nature, they tend to assume a lot of intentions and a lot of, decisions that people would not make naturally, which ultimately leads to people being put into situations where they cannot thrive. And by thrive, I mean eat, which means that they end up not being able to survive. And I think I've long said that communism would work if we had a different kind of human. And I think that's very much
true.
It's very much in line with what you're saying. It would work with people who are like fully in tune with, the higher powers, with God. And you can look at communities that are very, very communally structured, like Amish and Mormon and some of these other super religious but smaller communities that don't require...
I don't know, Amish are like, they're propagating like flies. They're going to take over America pretty soon. If you look at the logarithmic.
Yeah. I think you're right. Well, I think you're right, but they have found this great system of being a supportive community and doing things like coming together to build barns if someone needs one, and also preventing outside influences from having overt negative influences on the culture, which... Yeah,
you do get that homogeny, and I don't see how we resist. Well, I understand the left's dire fear of fascism. I have that too. I want color. I want difference and distinction, but there's a trade-off. I want a certain amount of variation. And I think that there's a reason why Christianity mutated to have so many different denominations. And after a bit of killing itself over those denominations, it kind of chilled out. But there's still a lot of rich diversity in Christianity, broadly construed, which I would even argue, not here and now, but I think that atheism is even a part of Christianity, I think.
Certainly
it's just kind of
in the West,
cleaned up in a way.
Yeah, certainly in the West. And that's always been kind of my argument with atheism. You can't really come at Christianity from a position of true scrutiny when you are yourself operating from the water in which you're both swimming, right? Because your whole life, your entire culture, your family, and all of your belief structures are built on something you deny, and that is the Judeo-Christian principles that came alongside of the Reformation, that came over to the U.S.
Don't forget the Talmud.
England. Oh, yeah, that's true too. And it is interesting to watch them try to argue against the very platform they're standing on, because it's just not going to work. And I understand having doubts about God and taking issue with some of the things that Christianity in the past has argued for, and that's fine. But you need to understand that you're arguing from a plank that they built,
Well, and at the same time, it behooves Christians to be very humble in the face of God.
Oh, yeah.
And to not assume that you know God's will or you're the harbinger of God's will. And it's really difficult. I understand. I did a episode very similar to this one that were kind of the same topic that we were doing now. And I discussed that I was doing Ramadan, the fast of Ramadan. And some guy came into my comments and got really mad at me for talking about Ramadan on Good Friday because I was slandering Christians or something. I'm like, I'm fasting, you're fasting. Well, and then there was this whole thing, are you Christian or not? And one woman showed up like, I'm crying, you're not a Christian. I'm like, dude, chill. No
need to cry.
Chill. So I think that Christians are humans too.
Yeah.
They assume that they know. And one of my projects that is very in the background of what I'm trying to do is trying to approach the process of believing in a more mature way, where my belief isn't something where I need to impose on other people. My belief is a mental an intentional set of programs or practices that help me orient myself towards reality. My belief is not reality. It
Right.
helps me to orient myself to reality. So going back to objective truth, I would argue that a good church is a place that orients you to reality, so that after you do the practice or do some worship or seek forgiveness and go through the worship and the ritual, that you are cleaner on the other end. You feel broader, you feel lighter, and then you get to engage with the world more cleanly. That's what's showing you that your faith is actually bearing fruits. The belief itself is secondary to where it sends you. And if it's sending you to a good place, then I think that's the proof of the faith, the proof of the believing aspect of religion.
That's interesting. And it's great that you mentioned that, because I was just listening to Dennis Prager talk to Jordan Peterson about this. And he was saying that in Jewish understanding, what they do first is establish the belief. And from that, you operate your actions. Whereas he says that Christianity is more waiting for getting an impression that something happened, and then you act according to that. I see the benefit from both. Honestly, I would be very interested in doing like an actual Bible study and seeing what the Bible has to say about whether you should wait for the feeling to strike you. But on the topic of feelings, I will say that as somebody who's recently started going back to church, there is an actual feeling, like a lightening of stepping away from all this ridiculous wokeness that's really infiltrated everything, and getting back to timeless truths that people have believed for thousands of years. And I wish that for more people, because there is something so freeing. And I think that most people still, being stuck in the 90s and some of this fundamentalist thinking, believe that religion is, all about tying you down and restricting you from doing all this fun stuff. Well, now we've been like the kid who got into the candy jar and is now sick. We've done all the fun stuff. We've indulged in the hedonism, and we've been incredibly selfish, and there's just been no end to it. And we're tired, and we're looking for some actual structure, some actual restraint. So as we wrap up, Benjamin, what is a silver lining we can give people? How do we think we can kind of help orient culture the right way? I know, just something light as we finish.
Okay,
no big deal. Just take about 5 seconds, right? Well, we have a few minutes, so.
Well, I think that I do think that there's guidance available to people, that we are. So I had a dream a long time ago where I was kind of in a very intense moment in my life where I was seeing a lot of spiritual truths, and a lot of things were being revealed to me in very rapid succession. And it was a gift, but it was also helping me to orient myself, because I was kind of off. I was heading in a bad direction, and so I received a number of different gifts. And one day I was hanging out with I had a dream. It was one of those dreams that became very, very real. And this young man approached me, and he said, "I want to show you something." And I'm like, "Okay." And so he took me outside of the world, and we went up into space, and we were looking down at the planet. And then I asked, "What if God stopped loving the world?" I just asked that, and the world just vanished. And not just like a disappearing trick, but it ceased to exist. And it was a terrible feeling. It was like, it was like the absence of existence, like intruded. And from that, I took a very necessary lesson in my own life, that everything is supported by love. God is love. God is continually radiating love, and that is the basis of existence. There's a floor of being in there, and I think that translates into the more complex forms. I do think that culture, I do think that people who are earnestly seeking the good will be revealed to them, because the good is reality. That is the reality. The evil is an obscuration or some sort of wrongful relationship to reality. It's nothing evil isn't anything in and of itself. So that's something positive that is a pure statement of faith and belief on my part.
I appreciate that fully. And I actually think that your dream was very revelatory, because that actually ties into my understanding of hell, which is an interesting topic that we're really not going to get into right here now at the
Have
end
you
of
been to
this.
hell?
No. And I'll tell you why. My family always taught us that hell was simply separation from God. And it strikes me that this feeling that you got when you asked the question, what if God stopped loving the world and it simply ceased to exist like it had never been, is probably a feeling similar to what the Christian understanding of hell is. And it's not eternal physical torture. It's not like anger or this feeling of, frustration or whatever. It's an actual feeling of absence, like there's just nothing there anymore, which should be terrifying to people. And when you mentioned that God is love, hold on, give me 1 second. When you mentioned that God is love, I want to firm that up a little bit for people, because I think that people get on board with like the John Lennon version of man, happy, hippy dippy love, free love, all this good stuff. I don't think that's what it is. Love in the Catholic tradition is to will the good of the other. And I think that you can firmly, fully, and fairly say that if you believe in a loving, kind, generous God who created us and who necessarily wants the best for us, his purest version of love would be to will our good, even if it's not what we want. And that's not going to make us happy all the time, but we can rest assured that it's going to turn us into people who are closer to being what God designed us to be, because we were created in his image.
Yeah. So you're Catholic now?
No. I'm just drawing on that from the Catholic inspiration, because I think that's such a good summary of what love is. No, we're going to a Presbyterian church right now, which is what I was raised in. And so far, so good. We're liking that, appreciating that kind of steadiness that you can't really get from the world anymore. Benjamin, it's been so great to talk to you. It's been great to have you as a guest instead of as a host. A lot of fun to kind of flip the tables in that regard. I hear you have some really fun interviews coming up in the near future. Looking forward to that for sure. Always love conversations. They are, in fact, very calming, as the name suggests. Thank you for taking the time today on such a short notice. Where can people find you?
Tons of fun. Twitter, Benjamin A. Boyce. YouTube, Benjamin A. Boyce. And any sort of podcast, it's Calm Versations. Calm, CALM Versations, VERsations, SATIONS. That was hard for me to do.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I think I might
Wonderful.
have missed it.
No,
but the
you
link,
got
I'm sure there will be in the description.
That's right.
As I tell my guests. Maybe
absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much, Benjamin, for joining us. And thank you to my audience for joining us too. This has been a great conversation. Hopefully you all got as much out of it as I did. Until next time. Bye, guys.